Everybody's got a number tattooed on their soul. And the time's gonna come, boys, when your number is called. Everybody gets a uniform and a hut to live in. They give you your rank. You tell 'em you're next of kin, but don't go looking over your shoulder for me. 'Cause I'm gonna be out on an island in the middle of the bright blue sea. Hello everyone, my name is Ian Garcia, this is Devotional Criticism, and welcome back to the New Movie Diary. This is a cinema criticism series in which I review recent, new, and up-and-coming film releases and attempt to give you the straight facts about them, in my humble opinion. Coming back into the swing of things after taking 2 weeks off, but following the rather, I think, successful double billing I pulled off with those last 2 episodes of this series with The Amateur and Warfare, I just wanted to do some quick catch-up stuff on 2 new movies I saw the other week before we jump into the subject for today properly. I did, in fact, see Sinners. I actually attempted to see it twice because this is a movie that's really lighting up the box office, as well as getting rave notices from the vast majority of professional critics. So when I just didn't care for it all that much, I thought I might as well try to give it another day in court, only to turn up to a late Thursday night screening of it that was just packed with Zoomers on their phones and couples who seemed to be talking well 15 minutes into the movie, and I just had to wonder, what am I even doing here? Look, I just think it's From Dusk Till Dawn, but not fun, and I'm not even a big booster of From Dusk Till Dawn. I'm just not in that film's cult following, and quite frankly, Sinners has a lot of the strengths of From Dusk Till Dawn, except of course in writer and director Ryan Coogler making his gracious return to original film productions after he just sort of blew up following his debut Fruitvale Station, itself all the way back in 2013, Sinners is definitely in its own stylistic idiom, as well as its own narrative and poetic idiom. It's not just a ripoff of From Dusk Till Dawn, but much like Tarantino and Rodriguez's own 1996 genre-bending, structurally unconventional Southern Gothic crime and vampire movie, I think Sinners basically completely falls apart as an experience once you get to the vampire stuff. I'm sorry, that climactic siege battle, it's poorly done, it's unconvincing, there's too much in the ensemble going on plot-wise and where the dramatic focus ends up being too distracted. I think Michael B. Jordan is terrible in this, suffering from the same new Hollywood leading man shtick of acting like a used car salesman whose real job is going to the gym for 2 hours a day, 5 days a week. I don't believe these twins he's playing who fought in the trenches of World War I and then spent a prodigal period as gangsters in Depression-era Chicago. And I don't believe he needs to be playing 2 of these characters who both have basically indistinguishable romantic dramatic subplots. I just wasn't terribly impressed by it as a production. It's a hard 2.5 out of 5 for me on Sinners. And Sinners was actually the second half of a personal double feature I indulged in the other week, which began with a little talked up Norwegian horror debut for writer-director Emily Blichfeld, that being The Ugly Stepsister, which is a very stylish, sensuous, at turns erotic, and utterly grotesque adult retelling of the Cinderella fairy tale from the point of view of the eponymous Ugly Stepsister. Some interesting stuff that Blichfeld does with her ironically not so unfaithful, nor in that sense not quite so twisted take on that story, though I do think that fidelity comes at a cost of Blichfeld being able to sustain our dramatic and emotional interest. The Ugly Stepsister is certainly a beautifully shot film with a lot of atmospheric energy and some great sense of just, again, at turns idyllic, fawning admiration of beauty in all of its forms, but also just grimy, gleeful preoccupation with all things corporeal and visceral and the body in a state of abjection. The original score by John Eric Cotta is also fantastic and possibly one of my favorite film soundtracks of the year so far. It's just not a movie to get that much emotional connection to, which I guess made it disappointingly of a piece for me as a pairing with Sinners, but I do grace The Ugly Stepsister at least with a fair 3 out of 5. With that out of the way, let's jump into this week's double feature, where the serendipitous theme I have decided is Holidays in the Sun, because we're going to be talking about 2 exciting new independent films making their limited but still rather accessible rollout into Main Street multiplexes this past weekend, that are both set against the at turns beautiful and eerie backdrops of escape to romantic seaside locales, both dealing interestingly and in their own ways with nostalgia and reckoning with dysfunction, both personal and familial, and both, again, in their own quite different ways, seeing those pathologies of dysfunction simmer and then boil over. I'm not quite beach bod ready for a Holidays in the Sun double feature review like this, but then again, I haven't been beach bod ready in like 7 years, and it's hot out there. So first up on this officially recommended double feature is The Surfer, written by Thomas Martin and directed by Lorcan Finnegan. This Australian-Irish co-production stars Nicolas Cage as the titular surfer who, though unnamed, returns to the southwest Australian shore town in which he grew up with the intentions of buying a scenic home there that he envisions will repair his estranged marriage as well as his relationship with his teenage son, only for him to face violent hostility from a gang of alpha male yuppies who basically run the town and refuse to let any non-locals surf in the area. This leads to a stressful and escalating battle of wills as Cage's character is pushed to the very extremes of physical and psychological deterioration, and which afterwards left me hankering for a second half of that double feature that was just a little bit lower key in both narrative and tone, which is exactly what I got with Bonjour Tristesse. This is the third adaptation of Francois Sagan's 1954 coming-of-age novel, now adapted in updated fashion as a feature film debut for writer-director Durga Chubose. Itself set against the backdrop of a remote seaside villa in the south of France, this adaptation stars Lily McInerney as the 17-year-old Cecile, the daughter of a charismatic but nonetheless philandering and amoral socialite single father named Raymond. He's played by Claes Bang, whose idyllic summer vacation is impugned upon by the sudden arrival of Anne, a much more disciplined, classically genteel, hard-working fashion designer who was once a close friend of Raymond and his late wife. She is played by Chloe Sevigny. I can't believe I'm butchering a name that I've seen so many times. Chloe Sevigny? Chloe Sevigny? I butcher a lot of names in these reviews, I'm sorry. It might as well be a calling card for me at this point. And though I was the one who decided to chase The Surfer with Bonjour Tristesse, I'd like to get into this one first just because, spoiler alert, I just didn't terribly care for it. As much as I posture as New Jersey's biggest movie snob, I really must admit that I'm something of a dilettante when it comes to literature and literary adaptations. I was not familiar with Sagan's novel before seeing this film, so unfortunately I can't in good faith fairly remark upon Chubose's film as an adaptation of it, especially in terms of what seems to be, from my research only, rather significant in that it is, despite its contemporary setting versus the time period of the novel, this film appears to be a far more faithful adaptation of Sagan's original novel in that for the longest time, Bonjour Tristesse was only available to English-language readers via a translation that was heavily censored and redacted to remove Sagan's much franker exploration of sexuality as well as the amorality that informs the subjectivity of her teenage protagonist. Whereas Chubose's adaptation is poised to deal with these themes head-on, with much of the dramatic tension of Bonjour Tristesse, so much as there is in its sort of languid, episodic pace, so much of that tension is derived from that irony as far as the character McInerney portrays this person who, because she is raised in an environment where there is not only so much privilege, but so little friction in terms of basically any expectations from her father, that in addition to being spoiled, she is critically lacking at her age for a sense of her own identity, just sort of glomming onto the charming pretenses and superficial beauty of others, which,
through my research, again, is an understanding of the story and this dramatic adaptation of it that's critical to really understanding where the story goes and where it ends. With whether or not Cecile really comes of age through her experiences, because her father has set her up so adrift, failing to challenge her so that she can find her own personhood through conflict with him, whether or not she really comes of age, so to speak, or she simply falls into another open-ended pattern of co-opting, playing with, and using the superficial charms of others. Which is itself an understanding of the film I kind of had to come to through my research, whereas unfortunately I found myself ultimately quite bored with Bonjour Tristesse. That's not to say that the film itself doesn't have some enthralling qualities, and for a feature film debut, Bonjour Tristesse is certainly impressive from a formal perspective, though not overly stylized at all. There's virtually no shot in this film that isn't sensual and picturesque. Leslie Barber's original score is lovely and idyllic as well, and all of that stuff really does work in a general sense of immersing you as a spectator in this environment of languid, frictionless privilege, the sort of setting that we are so often used to in everything from travel guide chick flicks to Happy Madison buddy comedies, to seeing as escapist and aspirational, whereas in Bonjour Tristesse, our sense of that beauty and escape is counterbalanced by our sense of its overall aimlessness and, again, remoteness from really understanding subjectivity, or whether the subjective or individual is considered terribly important or meaningful in this surface-obsessed environment. It's not merely the content of the plot, but the conveyance of the environment, of architecture, of costume and interior design that completes the atmospheric tableau Chubos seems to be attempting to channel, which all reflects back on the film's thematic preoccupation with that theme I touched on before, that irony. As opposed to a lot of coming-of-age stories or youth in rebellion films concerning spoiled, superficial teenagers, this trench of popular cinema that I think we're frankly more used to seeing involving escapades of extreme drug and alcohol use and dangerous sex and other forms of risk-taking, the refreshing thing about Bonjour Tristesse as an adaptation is that Cecile's lifestyle and rebellion are in and of themselves neither particularly dangerous or chaotic or spectacular. She's a spoiled rich girl in a far more germane and, I think, probably harder to stomach way for lots of us in a world where the chasm between wealth and precarity has grown so vast. She's a spoiled rich girl of a genre that doesn't immediately appeal to our nascent desire to see all these undeserving rich kids deflowered and corrupted and brought low. She really is just kind of a generic dumb teenager, not terribly impulsive for where she is, and whose position becomes rather accessible to us regardless of our background, because we in some sense come to understand far more acutely what this story is really about, which is that irony of a father who irresponsibly and passively attempting to give his child as much birth and freedom as possible to do what she wants and to find herself, basically sets her up for the ultimate disaster of never really knowing herself or her actions, because she's never had to overcome some intimate conflict. She's never had to define herself against authority, against the values of others, against, ironically, her own privilege. But I can already feel myself getting rather tiresomely essayistic in my presentation of that, because I think that as far as Chubos's dramatic presentation of this story, Bonjour Tristesse just feels a little too opaque for its own good. Though not overly stylized, there is this sensation one gets that Chubos and cinematographer Maximilian Pittner, in what is no doubt an attempt to immerse us in the subjectivity of these characters, which is no doubt rather surface-oriented and materialistic, it nonetheless comes off as being too preoccupied with the form of a subject's presentation rather than really describing the subject, and especially in a way that helps us understand the appeal and the private ecstasy of those surfaces, even in moments where it should be dramatically motivated, as opposed to just being confronted with superficial forms and it being obvious to us immediately, like, well, yes, that's very pretty, but it all feels very hollow and empty. Which is fine, but I also want to understand what the characters get out of that hollow emptiness. And when I don't feel that, I feel alienation from the movie, regardless of how well poised these filmmakers are, and especially this cast is to really inhabit these roles. I don't think the formalism of the movie is doing nearly as much as the cast of this movie is in really getting us into the emotional and headspace of these characters, which again doesn't really take us too far because Chubose doesn't really get us there. If anything, probably the most revelatory line of prose in the film comes in the very first scene, in which Raymond's lover, before Anne enters the picture, she and Raymond are watching Cecile standing on the beach at the edge of the water, and Raymond's lover, Elsa, she's played by Nailia Harsun, she remarks that Cecile is practicing being seen, i.e., that she's practicing not to get attention, but practicing imagining herself in such a light as she would like someone she's interested in to see her, in a way that is poised and formal, but nonetheless seeming nonchalant and self-preoccupied, and thus attractive to the kinds of men she wants. And I wish anything else in this film resonated merely as much with me as that line, because the energy that came from just that situation, and how it touched on my own sense of thinking back to my own youth, and despite the gendered way this adaptation presents that observation of coming of age and sexual aspirations, it really brought me back to my own feelings as a young man of times I would practice being seen. Just that little bit of a diamond bullet of prose really carried me through what turned out to be a rather long excursion into the vision of a debut filmmaker who, from a far different viewing of things, is like a lot of debut filmmakers and a lot of filmmakers in her very formally minded generational cohort, where she creates a work that really feels as though it is more practicing being seen rather than being very confident or assured in defining itself, its story, its setting, its characters, in describing that to us emotionally. Bonjour Tristesse is a very beautiful looking and sounding film, and there is certainly enough here to get me hankering to just read Sagan's novel for myself. But even for a movie about a spoiled rich girl who doesn't really know who she is because she has too much freedom to be forced to come into her own, the depth of feeling that the film inspires just doesn't tread too far beyond that bare bones assessment. That this is a story about a spoiled rich girl that doesn't even have anything spectacularly entertaining to show for it beyond how the film itself is only practicing being seen, rather than being about seeing something that goes beyond the surface necessarily, especially for those characters, even if we don't necessarily immediately identify with it. I hope popping my elbow got caught on the mic. That was a good one. And that all leads to the irony that while Chubose's debut certainly isn't nearly as stylized as the film I preceded it with, that again being The Surfer, it is rather the former film on this officially recommended Holidays in the Sun double feature, in its overt collage of influences and heightened presentation of its story and its own more ostentatious approach to a style that calls attention to forms. The irony becomes that The Surfer, the far more stylized of the two films, comes off as much less alienating in terms of its ability to describe its dramatic subject than Chubose's much more reserved, muted, intentionally less spectacular adaptation. And sure, this is a film from Irish filmmaker Lorcan Finnegan, most likely best known for his sophomore sci-fi film Vivarium. This is not a coming-of-age drama, but a blackly comic psychological thriller of the long downward spiral variety. And yet I still feel as though, for whatever its own flaws, I found in The Surfer a much more accessible exploration of, honestly, ironically, very similar themes to Bonjour Tristesse. The shared backdrop is key here, because whereas Bonjour Tristesse is a subversive, even somewhat satirical take on the pretenses of the coming-of-age story, in that it is a coming-of-age story for a teenage character who, because of her circumstances, it's really an open question as to whether or not she really can come of age by the story's end. The Surfer, on the other hand, with Cage as our desperate, flailing anti-hero trying in vain to repair his broken marriage and encourage his son, or really his own ambitions of becoming a professional surfer. It's a story all in that classic mold of a man who returns to the soil of his youth, only to find that the purity he's attempting to reclaim is impossible because it was never real in the first place. Again, the settings that we tend to associate with aspiration and escapism are, in themselves, zones of great tension and corruption and even evil, where superficial beauty masks a voracious animal craving to dominate and control. And in its own hyper-stylized portrayal of this setting, it must be said, Finnegan and cinematographer Radzik Latsuk, their visual work here is nothing short of incredible. The narrative of The Surfer itself is just such an oddball mixture. Even if you can at once accurately call it a psychological thriller, the plot of it is really more of a chaotic fusion or collage of so many sometimes seemingly contradictory strains of popular cinema, from the more serious cerebral stuff of other dramatic portrayals of broken down men's downward spirals into obsession and self-destruction, not the least one of star Nicolas Cage's own most important performances in Leaving Las Vegas, to a gumbo of dumb 80s action junk like Roadhouse and Point Break, to an updated satire a la Fight Club in terms of its additional portrayal of the film's villainous yuppie surfers as being part of almost like a cult of self-help that both elevates and destroys men with this mythopoeic mythology of how they model strength and perseverance and security for their reactionary communities, all the while basically just getting away with what they're doing because they're really rich. To say nothing even of some elements of the classic Wicker Man, along with that portrayal of the film's villains as really more of a privileged cult than as really a genuine homespun group of surfer bros, to finally, of course, this being an Australian co-production, a clear love of the canon of late 20th century Australian new wave cinema that in many ways attempted to channel the sense of almost apocalyptic displacement and unease that country seems to have inspired in so many filmmakers, with a special note of influence definitely being Ted Kotcheff and Evan Jones's immortal 1971 adaptation of Kenneth Cook's novel Wake in Fright. And all of these influences are conveyed through a similarly collage-like set of aesthetic influences that range no doubt from the classics of the surf film, like Bruce Brown's seminal documentary The Endless Summer, to more than a fair bit of spaghetti westerns of the Sergio Leone variety. Whereas much of the first act of the film, especially its night photography, is done in this style that is so incredibly reminiscent of the work of cinematographer Robbie Mueller, especially his collaborations with Wim Wenders, such as Paris, Texas. Look, this is film snob time, but people are gonna see some of the stuff Finnegan and Latsuk have managed to pull off with this, on the face of it, even rather silly and gratuitous movie about a deadbeat rich dad who gets drawn into a battle of wills with a bunch of surfer chads because he just can't let go of his own maladaptive fantasism and nostalgia. This is an incredibly bleak and silly movie that nonetheless has cinematography so beautiful and considered as it's priming us before the real devolution and fall from grace for its antihero, that real film snobs are gonna watch it and be like, nobody except Robbie Mueller is even supposed to be able to get nighttime shots with colors as lush and saturated and present as this. How are these guys even doing this? This movie is so beautiful looking, it's almost sacrilegious. And yet, in spite of how almost gratuitously formal it is, as much as it is an exercise in the sensual almost above all, I must say that I found in Finnegan's film a far more intimate attention to really describing the subject that's at the center of it all, to marshal all the formal beauty that he and his technical team were capable of, to really tell this story that never loses grounding in the fact that it is fundamentally steeped in the desperation and desire of this one guy. And that's all before even getting into the absolutely immaculate score by Francois Tétaz, which, not unlike Barber's own score for Bonjour Tristesse, eschews what I find to be the rather tiresome trend of synthetic electronic sounds and minimalism and droning that has dominated so much of independent cinema, especially genre cinema, over the last decade or so, and at least appropriate to the aspirational and deceptively idyllic backdrops of both these films. They mark a return for independent and especially genre cinema, in the case of The Surfer, to music that shows more virtuosity, more elegance, and isn't afraid, especially in the case of Tétaz's work for The Surfer, to even go a little overboard with it, especially in terms of his compositions that are used to score the first act of the film, to convey this sense of almost comical idealism, rather than dour seriousness or caustic aesthetic droning that merely, again, reflects whatever the shot content is, as opposed to sometimes being a counterpoint to the shot, maybe ironically subverting the shot. There's much more interesting stuff going on with Tétaz's work in The Surfer here than I've seen in a lot of genre movies over the last 10 years. The thing is that for as gratuitous as The Surfer is from a formal perspective, I nonetheless found myself emotionally engaged with it far more than Chiboz's more grounded and arguably even more psychologically substantive debut. Because whereas the formal presentation of Bonjour Tristesse only seems to betray its own unintended pretensions, there is an absolute ecstasy to The Surfer that makes its more fantastical, more transparently symbolic story more emotionally relatable, if not necessarily convincing. What it really comes down to is that I think Chuboz is just a little too consumed in practicing being seen, so that she doesn't endeavor to give us what it is for her characters that draws us to these environments that we can acknowledge are pretty, but immediately identify as being alienated because, again, all of their naturalness, all of their nonchalance, it's clearly all a poise. Whereas I think what really hits home with what Finnegan does with The Surfer, even though it's a way more over-the-top story, fundamentally he taps into the fact that, yes, we as regular audiences, we do have envy for this type of stuff. We do identify these spaces with escapism and adventure and aspiration and whimsy and ecstatic liberation, so that we kind of need to have that sensual preoccupation appeased if we're going to go down the rabbit hole with you, however spectacular or non-spectacular it is. You gotta give us something of the emotional appeal we all relate to and understand, so that you can take us down the line to, okay, this is where this all symbolically is really leading for these characters ensconced in and obsessed with and kind of grounded in and trapped in this world. And that's basically the reason that while I am giving The Surfer my more confident approval, I'm going to be tagging it with a very enthusiastic 4 out of 5. This is the new release to see this week. I am forced to acknowledge that while proving to be a virtually perfect counterpoint to this big, silly, sensational thriller drenched in self-effacing masculine insecurities, Bonjour Tristesse, in its own arguably more grounded and serious and mature approach to describing the developmental prison of a spoiled rich girl, in its own performance of being seen, just didn't really hit home for me, so that will be getting a reluctant 2.5 out of 5. But I want to do my due diligence and be clear, I am recommending both these films as a package deal, especially. They really are, for whatever their flaws, two refreshing, respectively entertaining, and engaging enough works of independent cinema with very impressive formal execution. And who knows, maybe this is just my implicit bias showing, because really, at the end of the day, why am I, as a man, feeling so much more drawn to this silly, hyper-masculine, obsessed downward spiral genre thriller starring Nick Cage in a, let's face it, good but not necessarily stand out, very much of a type performance for him, than I am to the story that is just about a spoiled teenage girl dealing unconsciously with how being so passively raised by her father has led her to this possibly eternal developmental dead end in her own life story. I'm prepared to admit there might just be some stuff in Bonjour Tristesse that is more mature and more pertinent and probably more worth the time of people to engage in than just an admittedly ecstatic, rowdy Nick Cage genre movie. I'm just saying, and without trying to be a white knight about it, I may just prefer the big dumb guy movie because of my own implicit sexism. Which is another reason to go ahead with a double feature, to treat these two films as exciting, well-paired companion pieces, because while on their own they certainly do enough to keep you engaged, it's together you really get to see a serendipitous artistic dynamic, that sort of communication between pieces that I talked up all the way back with my pairing of The Amateur and Warfare a couple weeks ago. That golden mean of a great double feature where the two movies talk to one another with two different perspectives on very similar themes and settings and character types. But this double feature review is already way too long in the tooth, so I'm gonna sign out from there with a warm thanks to anyone who stuck through this video all the way through. Don't be a stranger to sounding off in the comments. What did I get right? What did I get wrong? Otherwise, please share, like, subscribe, bell, yada yada. My name is Ian Garcia. This is Devotional Criticism, and this was the new movie diary. I'm gonna catch you guys next time.